So guys, let us discuss the code walk of our HTTP web server. So here you can see that as usual I have a main function, and inside that main function I have called the function setup TCP server communication. So inside that function I implement the entire functionality of TCP web server. So as we have discussed that our TCP web server maintains a database of students. So here you can see that I have defined the data structure of student type. Here we have the student name, student roll number, the student hobby, and the department to which the student belongs. And I have just maintained the array of these structures, and this array contains the information about 5 students. So this array simulates as a database that is residing on a HTTP web server. When a server receives a request, then our server will search this database and pick up the particular student based on roll number. So let us come back to our function setup TCP server communication. As I said that our HTTP web server is exactly same as a normal TCP server. So following are the steps that you have already learned regarding how to implement a TCP server. There are absolutely no difference. So you can see that in the step 1 it's an initialization phase. In the step 2 you have created a master socket file descriptor. Then in the step 3 you have filled up the server information regarding the port number. So our web server is listening on port number 2000. Then you have bind the socket, right? Then listen system call. So all the steps are exactly same as normal TCP server that you have already learned. Then you are calling a select system call and now waiting for the client connection request, right? In this case you are waiting for the request from the browser. Then as soon as you receive the request from the browser, you create a communication file descriptor using accept system call. Again exactly the same steps. And when you receive the connection request from the client, your TCP server now waits for the actual data from the client. So considering that the client, that is the browser, has sent the request to our server will get unblocked from the receive from system call, and now we comes here. So in this portion we implement the HTTP web server specific functionality, right? So you can see that as soon as our server receives any data from the client, our server prints the data that is received from the client as it is. That is, we are printing the entire buffer here. So you can see in the demonstration part, this highlighted portion is the actual message that the server received the moment you enter the URL in the browser and press enter. So you can see that the message received, the first line that your server has received is the request line, right? And since it's a GET request, therefore first word is the GET, the second part is the URL, and the third part is the HTTP version number. So we have already discussed the format of the GET request, and the highlighted portion on the screen is the message that our server receives from the client. And as I said that the rest of the lines in this request are added automatically by the browser. So the second step is that our server will going to parse this request line and try to identify the roll number of the student. So the first thing to be done is to extract the request line out of the entire message that is received from the client. That is, the server has to extract out the first line. So the delimiter here will going to be new line character, that is /n. So if you split this entire string using /n, that is the new line character, as a delimiter, then you will have tokens, and those tokens are nothing but one complete line. But one complete line of text present in this request. So you can see we have chosen a delimiter as a /n, and we simply call the strtalk function of C on the data buffer, and you pass the delimiter. So here the delimiter is /n. So what happens that after this call, the request line is actually the first line of the message that we have received from the client. So we have extracted the request line from the client message, because the server only needs the information that is present in the request line to process the data and return the result. So in this line we have extracted the request line from the client message. Now we have changed our delimiter to space, and now we will going to split the request line based on space. So our method will now be our method is a string which says that whether the request is a GET request or POST request. So you can see that we have extracted out the first word that is present in the request line, and that word is a GET. So we know that the client has sent the GET request and not POST request. So the URL can be extracted by calling the strtalk function again and pass the delimiter and just pass the null here. So for that, now you have to understand that how strtalk function works. I request you that Google and try to understand how strtalk function works. So here we have extracted out the method which is a GET, and we have extracted out the URL from the request line. So the next step is that based on the method type, that is the method is a GET or the method is a POST, because the client can send you a GET request or a POST request. So in this example the client has sent us the GET request, therefore this condition will be true, and we simply call the process GET request function, which is the function written by us, and in this function we pass the URL and we pass the response length, the pointer to the integer variable, and this response length will actually contains the length of the entire response that the server will sending back to the client. So going inside the process GET request function, you can see that we have passed the URL here. So the URL is actually the URL string looks like this, right? Remember, in the browser you pass the URL something like this in this format. So here you can see that you need to split this string based on question mark first, because the server needs to know the roll number of the student, right? So using strtalk function and strtalk function repeatedly, you can split this string and eventually you can extract out the value of the roll number. Now I am skipping all this discussion of strtalk because you really have to understand how strtalk function works and how using strtalk function you can split the strings. So as you can see, because the message format of HTTP webs, so here you can see that the message format of HTTP protocol is of text nature, therefore we need to rely on too much of string handling function here, right? So here we are iterating over the array that acts as a database to the HTTP web server, and based on the roll number that comes in the URL, the server extracts out the student information from the database, right? Now simply the server has to prepare a response and send back to the client, right? So to send back the response we need a buffer which will going to store the response message. So you can see in the next line we are using again too many string handling functions, like here we are using strcpy, and you can see that in this strcpy function to the response buffer we are simply copying the HTML code, right? So this HTML code does nothing but it just creates a table which have one column and one row, and inside that one column one row we fill up the student name which matched with the roll number, right? So basically you are generating the HTML code and you are storing that entire HTML code inside the response buffer. Now, as we have discussed that when HTTP web server replies back to the client, it has to reply back in the response format. So here we take some more memory, which we call it as header, right? And we assume that the header will be of size 248 bytes at least, and this header, and following the header will be the HTML code that we have just generated above. So we have already discussed this in the previous slide here. So here you can see that when HTTP web server sends back the response to the client, it has the header and followed by the HTML code. So we have already discussed that this HTML code has been generated, which contain a table which have one row and one column, and that table contains only the name of the student which matched with the roll number. So the next thing that we are doing is to create this header, right? So to create this header, we have taken the memory space, and now to this header we are copying the text. That is, you can see the first line HTTP 1.1200 OK. So same thing here. Then second thing that you can copy here is the server name. So this could be anything. Server is a keyword, whereas following after the colon you can pass any string which should be a server name. Then the next is the content len. So here I have one mistake. This line should come here, right? So I have taken a content length. So content length should be the size of the entire message that you are sending back to the client. So I have just hard coded this value to 2048, but it should be exactly the size of the message that you are sending back to the client. And then because our HTTP web server, you can see that after returning from this function, we will going to close the connection. Therefore, our HTTP web server is sending the connection status as closed to the client, right? And then just add few more strings in this particular format, like this content type, text HTML, and all this stuff. So after this line, our HTTP response header has been prepared, and after that you have to append the entire HTML code. So here you can see, you can simply concatenate the header with the response that you have already prepared above. So basically after this line you have completely prepared the HTML response to be returned back to the client. Right? Your HTML response contains two parts, the header as well as the response. So after concatenating the header and the response, you have actually prepared this entire message. Right? Now because strcat function will concatenate the response and store, or it will copy the entire response string into the header memory, therefore you can free up the response memory here, right? So after returning from this function, so you can see that this function is actually returning a pointer to the entire response message that is supposed to be returned to the client. So after returning from this function, we have the response here, which is to be sent back to the client by our server. So you can see if we have got some response, the server simply call a send to function call and send back the response to the client, right? And after sending back the response to the client, you can simply free up the memory that you have allocated, right? And then rest of the state machine of this server works as usual. So the entire thing here is that how the server parses the HTTP request from the client using a string handling function, and from the URL how it extracts out the parameters based on which the server has to prepare the response. In this case, the parameter was the roll number, right? So you can see, because the HTTP protocol is actually a text-based protocol, that is the reason that you have to do so much of string manipulation in order to implement HTTP web servers. Also, the second thing to note here is that the final response that you are sending back to the client is actually the HTML code. So if you had written this HTML code in the text file and executed on the browser, it would have run the same way, right? So you can see that we are following the standards. We are preparing the message in compliance to the HTTP protocol. So on the client side, the message, that is the HTTP client request, is prepared by the browser automatically, and on the server side we have to do it manually, something like this. So that's all with the discussion of the code walk of the HTTP web server. Because we have implemented a minimal functionality of the HTTP web server, consider a scenario where you would want to return a complete web page to the client, so that on the client side the browser can display that complete web page. You can consider that instead of writing this code could have been as big as generating a big enough web page. So it is this code that will grow in complexity depending on how complex the web page the web server is returning to the client to be displayed by the client, right? So now let us discuss certain observations regarding HTTP web server design and implementation.